Okay, we are going live and I am admitting everyone now.
Thank you so much, Marty. I don't see Julie. Where is she?
Hi, Julie.
Hi. Hi, Julie.
Welcome everyone to our program today. I'm going to mute everyone and invite our speakers to begin.
Okay, thank you. Yes.
Sue, you need to unmute yourself to begin.
All right, I'll begin again. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome everyone. We're happy that you are able to join us this afternoon for the first of our sessions in our two-part session webinar series, which is entitled The Catholic Church Involvement in Native American Boarding Schools, Walking the Good Road Towards Healing. This webinar series has been planned by the Listening, Learning, and Education Subcommittee of AHP. And AHP is short for U.S. Catholic Indigenous Boarding School Accountability and Healing Project. You will notice that we have recently refined and slightly changed the former name of AHP. I'll start by introducing myself, Sister Sue Torgerson, member of the Congregation of St. Joseph, and I live in Cottage Grove, Minnesota, which is the land, the ancestral land and the rightful land of the Shakopee Mdewakanton Dakota people. And by way of finding out who all is here, we invite you at this time to take a moment to enter your name and location into the chat. And if you know on whose ancestral land you reside, we invite you to make that acknowledgement. Let's just take a couple of moments for that and enjoy maybe scrolling up and down the chat to see who all is here. And before Father Mike begins, we just ask to make sure that you are muted and that you keep yourself on mute unless there is reason for you to have to speak. It can be very difficult. The noise might be a very little bit on your end, but it gets magnified in the whole Zoom process. Also, we encourage you to have your settings so that you're on speaker view as the program begins so that you can actually see the speakers. We'll be introducing people along the way, and when they speak, then their picture will show up and you'll have a chance to see who they are. So this will happen during the course of our presentation. So I would like to welcome and introduce Father Mike Carson. Father Mike is a priest of the Diocese of San Jose, California. And since 2016, Father Mike has served as the Assistant Director for Native American Affairs of the USCCB, which is the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And with his position, Father Mike serves as a liaison from USCCB to AHP, our Organization of Accountability and Healing. Father Mike grew up in the spiritual and cultural ways, learning those ways from the Choctaw people from his grandfather, who was fully Choctaw. Father Mike's presentation is entitled Native Boarding Schools, Learning from History to Promote Healing. We want to acknowledge at the beginning of our time together the possibility that as this history is recounted, there is also the possibility of the occurrence of painful memories or realizations that can happen to individuals who are participating. We suggest that should this be your experience, that you take the opportunity to do what you need to do for self-care. And our prayer is with you as you continue on the journey toward healing. Following his presentation, we will have opportunity for questions, comments, and responses by way of using the chat feature. Please join me in welcoming Father Mike, who will lead us in opening prayer as he begins his presentation. Welcome, Father Mike.
Thank you, Sister Sue. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and Holy Spirit. Bless you, Lord, our God, for being with us during the season of Lent. Let us learn from each other and how it can be your children of healing and reconciliation, especially of those who are left out in society and our native communities. Amen. In the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Okay, we're going to try to share some screen here for my PowerPoint. It'll work. Okay, the first part, I actually have this in two parts. The first part is the bishops and therefore the Roman Catholic Church's response to the native boarding schools and native boarding school crisis. I got into this work because the USCCB subcommittee on Native American Affairs for the last some 6 years, ever since I've gotten on board, has been interested in being concerned about this issue. In 2018, together with the Black and Indian Mission Office, the USCCB, and different organizations, we got the Catholic Native leadership together in Phoenix. We just had a week of just talking, just dialogue with Catholic Native leaders, with the bishops of the subcommittee, but also other bishops, finding out what was important, what would be a priority for them, not only for bishops, for the Roman Catholic Church. The Catholic Native leaders made it very clear that Catholic Native ministry cannot go forward unless this issue is dealt with, this boarding school issue is dealt with at the very highest level, the bishop's level, at the USCCB level. And they made it very clear that's a great concern, not only for Catholic natives, but also for natives in general. So that's why the USCCB, the bishops subcommittee, has grabbed onto this subject, has been working on this subject and this issue for the last, the last 7 years. Now, let's keep in mind when we're talking about the USCCB, I've heard it said, well, why doesn't the USCCB do something? Well, let's keep in mind that the USCCB actually is a tool of the bishops. It's the bishops who tell the USCCB what to do, not the other way around. We're very much at the request of the bishops, trying to help them to formulate some good policies dealing with the Catholic natives and Native American issues. So it's up to them, up to the bishops in the United States, to inform the USCCB to act on any of these issues or concerns. So that's when we think about what is involved here, just keep that in mind, especially when we talk about what issues and concerns that we need to go forward on this issue. I mean, what shapes our response? Okay, back in 2022, I think it was last year, the USCCB under two major committees, first the Subcommittee of Native American Affairs that I worked for under leadership of Bishop Wall from Gallup, the Committee on Justice, Peace, and Human Development, which is a policy for anything dealing with social justice in the United States, Archbishop Coakley from Oklahoma. They came together for a joint statement, not only for an apology, but also where do we go from here? When I've been involved in this issue and this concern, natives have made it very clear, Catholic natives have made it very clear that they just don't want an apology, because they don't want an apology just to say, we're sorry, and then we go off on other things. If you have an apology, they want it very specifically. These are steps that we need to back up that apology, very specific steps and ways that we can work on this issue and be concerned for Native Americans throughout the country, not just for Catholic Native Americans, but Native Americans throughout the country. So we came together with our staffs to work out and hammer out what we should do, what should be the steps necessary to move this issue forward, especially to promote both healing and reconciliation. This is the first time this letter was sent out. Is the first time the USCCB has taken an official stand on Native boarding schools. The letter goes out beyond an apology, but again, as I said, set up a step-by-step process that helps with not only bishops, but the entire Roman Catholic Church and what needs to be done, what needs to follow through. This letter is an action plan that requests all bishops buy in, whether or not they have Native schools or where they have Native schools, or if they didn't have Native schools. It's a policy for a Roman Catholic Church. And more importantly, it sets up a structure for moving forward. But let's keep in mind, as I said before, this letter is a suggestion. Bishops can opt out and say, no, we're going to do our own thing. But this is a letter, a suggestion to all bishops in the United States that to grab on this issue and move this issue forward. Okay. But we just don't have the letter. We also have Pope Francis. Pope Francis did two things. One, invited the natives of Canada, the First Peoples, into the Vatican to talk with them. And then again, when the Pope visited Canada to talk with the First Peoples. There's points from his homily, and this is in the Vatican when he was talking to the First Peoples. First, he care for land is related to the fight against colonialism. Pope Francis has been very much kind of melding the two, the idea of environmental justice with the care and consideration of Native and Indigenous rights. So throughout his writings, throughout his homilies, he's kind of joined those two and see them as kind of the same issue. Native cultures is, again, what he said, Native cultures are a gift to all humanity, and therefore any attack on Native cultures is an affront to humanity, kind of undoing the past, 200 years, saying that in our Catholic Church, we embrace Native cultures, and then we take a stance against those who try to destroy Native cultures. He goes on to say, boarding schools are a social harm and part of the sin of colonialization. He's making sure that Catholic Native boarding schools, past tense, were used to destroy Native cultures and therefore was a harm. So that kind of undoes some of the ideas that the Catholic schools, especially involving abuse, were not part of sin and evil of colonialism. And then the Pope was personally affected by boarding school stories. The First Peoples of Canada told him about their stories, their trauma that they went to and their families went to. And he was personally affected by these stories. The people talked about how unresolved traumas have become intergenerational traumas. This is just not the trauma of boarding school, but that trauma is long lasting. And we'll talk about more about this in the presentation, especially when we get to history of how we can deal with historical trauma, not just the traumas from the boarding school itself, but those traumas last from one generation to the next. The Pope expressed personal indignation and shame for those who work in the church that have committed such great harms and great sins. And the Pope expressed that he is personally sorry for what happened. So we take that and we understand what the post message and how we do apply that not only for Canada, but also to the Catholic Church. Okay, let's talk about some of the sins of the boarding schools. First sin is the forced removal of children. There's been some discussion how we cannot assess blame because we not live in those times. I've heard it from Catholics, non-Catholics. He says, hey, that we can't blame these people in the early 1900s and late 1800s for forced removal of children because we just didn't live that time. We didn't have any context. However, we believe in the same faith. And when we believe in the same faith, we also believe in the same doctrine. The doctrine was true of our Catholic Church today as it was 100 years ago, as it was true 200 years ago. That our doctrine does not change, and our moral and immoral, sinful and virtuous ideas do not change. We have the same plan of action from now and 2,000 years ago. Our plan of action is based on Christ. We match that plan only in changing circumstances. I understand the temptation when the federal government offers to pay for Catholic native schools. When you show up with a paycheck or with a check, that is understandable. But then it becomes a concern when the federal government says, okay, in order to accept this money, you need to do these certain things. Now, that has to be a litmus test to our own faith and say, do these changes, do these things that they want, does that apply to our faith? If it does not apply to our faith, same 200 years ago as it is today, it says, no, thank you. We can't use your money. We can't use your strings attached. Okay, the sin. Back then, we're talking about 200 years ago, 100 years ago, we see parents as the primary educators of children. That's our Catholic doctrine. Once children were being abducted and sent to boarding schools, the answer should have been, no, we're not going to do that because that violates our faith. This is a line that violates what we have, believe, and should not be crossed. But we do not blame to say the Catholic Church should never be involved in Native ministry or Native schools. But there are some things that, again, that violate our faith. The process of understanding these things went wrong is built in ways that make sure tragedies do not happen again. So we say, hey, these people violated their faith. We have to make sure we have set in place some certain things that do not violate our faith again. Or we learn from our past or to make a better future. This action resistance that is just as important as forgiveness. When we feel for others, those feelings are put in action. When we feel for our parents who had their children removed, or we feel for children who didn't see their parents for years and years and years, that's heart action. That's compassion action. And then with that feeling of compassion, then it moves us to do something different. Okay, second problem. And that of abuse. Back then, as is today, hurting children is a great moral evil. Once abuse surfaced, the schools need to be closed and investigated. That did not happen for the most part. We should have seen it as a line that violates our faith and should not be crossed. I have to think about the abuse, sexual, physical, cultural. They all have a root cause, kind of trunk of the tree, and the sin of racism. And what racism did or does is to multiply any type of abuse. Like other sins, the harm is magnified. Cruel punishment back then is by racism increases and does much harm for the children. So when we talk about hurting kids, we have to take a step back and where's that hurt comes from? Is saying that my culture, who I am, is more important than your culture, and therefore that allows me, gives me justification for abuse. Okay. Cultural annihilation. Back then, we're talking about 100 years or 200 years ago, that we see Christ as beyond culture. In order to be a church, a universal church, we have to venerate all cultures. Once the federal government required only English to be taught in the Catholic boarding schools, the answer should be no, because it violates our faith and should be a line that should not be crossed. Superiority of culture is not faith-based. In fact, it's the opposite of faith. It's the foundation of sin, again, as said before, as racism. When superiority hides itself with faith, then destruction, mistrust, and cultural annihilation ensues. Okay. So again, cultural annihilation violates our faith both now, 100 years ago, and 200 years ago. Okay, what are we going to do about it? The 4 steps from the letter that I talked about earlier, from the Bishop Wall, Archbishop Coakley letter. Now, why this letter is important? Because it puts bishops on notice that this is what we need to do. So it's kind of our action step, not only for the bishops of the United States, but for our Roman Catholic Church. The first intent of the letter was to forewarn bishops of the report of the Department of Interior, the Holland Report, and its implications. It's also within the letter, the 4 steps. It's outlined not only bishop's response, but the Catholic Church in the United States, as I said before. The second intent is to go beyond an apology, or develop actions rather than words. And the 4 steps that we're going to go into is tribal listening sessions, to work on a better relationship with tribes within your diocese, archival research, and full cooperation with investigations, both federal, but also tribal entities. Okay, let's go on. Okay, tribal listening sessions. I've heard from a lot of different organizations, Catholic organizations throughout the United States who have done these tribal listening sessions, and it has been actually spectacular. I think of all the things that we listed, I think this is the one most important thing we do in terms of healing and reconciliation, is just to listen to people who've been hurt by the Roman Catholic Church or by even federal boarding schools, and listen to their pain and suffering. And a lot of people, a lot of natives just want to be listened to because nobody has listened to them before, and then feel the truth of their stories. That becomes very important. So if you guys want to get involved in listening sessions, contact me in my office, and I'll put you in contact with those who have been very successful throughout the country about these tribal listening sessions. Okay, some 4 important points for a tribal listening session. 1, do not get defensive. In a situation where harm has been caused, there's always temptation, especially if you represent the Catholic Church, to be defensive. In the engagement, when harm has been done, committed, there's always confrontation. I think Macaw Blackhelp talks about the first step of as being confrontation. Being defensive, secretive, or condescending does not help anyone. It's the opposite of what we're looking for in these listening sessions. Anyone on the Catholic Church side must begin these listening sessions with an open heart. For listening sessions is done by promoting Native involvement in all levels. That leads me to the second point, that these listening sessions have to be Native-led enterprises. It does not help to have a white guy like myself getting involved, although I do have some Native ancestry, to get involved and say, you need to come together to listen. It always helps to have somebody who's organizing it and somebody who is the voice of these listening sessions to be Native, particularly from the tribe or from the organization that you're going to have listening sessions from. The listening sessions from Oklahoma have done by the Choctaw or all the tribes done, the Catholics who are members of those tribes. I said they've been very successful. Third, be open. Along with not being defensive, be open to what the Spirit leads. Be careful about cutting somebody off or interrupting. And validate feelings. Feelings are neither bad nor good, they are. And you have to validate somebody's feelings, what they feel from, especially from past trauma. It's very important to validate these feelings. Be transformative. Don't be afraid to apologize on the behalf of the Roman Catholic Church. And people say, well, I can't apologize because I don't have the authority to do that. Well, from the USCCB, we give you authority in these listening sessions. When somebody goes through these trauma or these pain and these suffering, it helps sometimes when you say, on behalf of the Roman Catholic Church, I want to say what these people did to you was wrong. It was evil. It was sinful, and it should not have happened. Because sometimes that's the first time a Native has ever heard those words. Oftentimes throughout their life, the pain, the suffering, the sin, the evil has been validated. You want to get away from that and say, hey, I've called what it is. The sin, this evil is not appropriate. It was wrong and should never have been done. So it's important to be transformative. Okay. Logistics can be an important part of listening session itself. We make sure everyone is on the same page. The tribal community is the entity that can put in place what is needed for healing to take place. Always talk to the tribe, and especially the elders of the tribe. Especially a specific cultural environment is very, very important. Some people who've done these listening sessions tell me that the church itself causes so much pain and suffering with the natives that they don't want to have it in the church. So you have it in a tribal hall. So that becomes very important in terms of the logistics, because the logistics themselves can be very, very healing. Although there are models of listening sessions, each one will be different because the needs and culture of Native communities are different. The only way to ensure that listening sessions will be healing and beneficial for participants is to start a listening session that from those who know the culture, the history, and the narrative. We don't want to come into these listening sessions without knowing anything. We have to know where the boarding school was, the abuse, if there's what that was, and especially the culture, because sometimes the term reconciliation should not even be used in these listening sessions. We use the term healing. You have to know the culture that these listening sessions are going to take place, okay? And the other 4 areas that I have on the screen here, again, reconciliation means different things to tribes. What are the outcomes for all that they're hoped for, and where shall it be held, and who works on the agenda? All these 4 things have got to be worked out ahead of time, just so we're not surprised, or we're not gone to a place where we don't want these listening sessions to go. So again, all these are very important in terms of establishing a listening session. And I'm available to help at the USCCB for these listening sessions. And being involved in these listening sessions, I found that they're the most in terms of healing and reconciliation. Okay, the second. The bishops ask also for a better relationship with tribes, not only for bishops and archbishops, but for parishes, for schools, Catholic schools, even for parishioners, to always look at ways that we can have better relationships with the tribes in their community. Like all aspects of Catholic ministry, relationships are the most important tools of evangelization. Communication breaks down because of lack of knowledge on both sides. Dialogue promotes an understanding where misconceptions are avoided. Building up a relationship with tribal communities also helps in healing historical trauma and distrust. A lot of distrust comes because we just don't know each other. So we go out and find areas that we can work in common, especially with the tribes in our community. Okay. The action of a better relationship is just not the province of a bishop or the archbishop, but it's done even at the local level. And I have 4 suggestions. 1, have a person from your tribe talk to your local school. So you can just say to a person from your tribe, where right now at our school, our Catholic school, we're going to talk about natives. Could you come to our community, an elder from that local tribe, to talk to about what it is like, both as history, but as now, as being a native in our community. Talk to your tribal council about mutual interest. Perhaps there's a concern, a legislature concern, or a law concern that the tribes are interested in. See if we can get involved in that, see if there's mutual interest. Invite tribal councils to use your facilities if they need to. Perhaps you have a church hall that's not being used. Perhaps you go to the tribal council and say, that hall can be used, you're welcome to use it, and have that connection. Participate in tribal activities, such as powwows or any other things that your tribe are doing, especially when it comes to getting information about the tribes. See if you can do that by research, by contacting the tribal leaders. Okay, number 3. Archival records. There are 2, there's now more than 2, but there are 2 most important archival associations. Archive Association of Women's Religious and the Diocesan Archive Association, and both members of the Catholic Boarding School for Healing Accountability. I think it's changed the name, the AHP. They're a very important part of our movement of the AHP. So we use them. They help us in terms of how do we go forward in terms of getting this information out. The AHP is geared toward all aspects of healing with Native communities for the church. Specifically, they're involved in archive research on all records dealing with Native and Catholic boarding schools. The AHP is working out a number of questions, such as, and we're trying to do this as we speak, what defines a boarding school? Where the Catholic boarding schools located and who ran them? Both legally and morally cannot be released, and how to make them public. You think that this would be quite easy if you have information about boarding schools, you just make that public. However, there's federal laws involved. Obviously, we can't make public medical information or even information on grades, stuff like that. So it's got to be a process of making information public. So we're working on that with the AHP. Marquette University has the archives of Black and Indian Mission Office. They also have links to different archives that have records of Catholic boarding schools. It's a good place to start if you want to do a research and find out where this information is. And like I said, there's a lot of privacy involved in trying to give this information out there, but it's important work to be done. Okay. Archival records. The information is recoverable is usually by your own day. Let's talk about information that we have readily available. Facts and figures are just recorded. Day-to-day activity of what went on in Native boarding schools is not information that is usually there, and it's not detailed. Information we have, which is not as useful, class size, grant applications, name of students, building construction, and basic receipts. These are the information that we have that I've seen in terms of our archives. Even a little information can cause a great amount of healing, but there are information that we really like to have that's just not there. We like to have disciplinary records of students, children taken away from their homes, disciplinary records of priests, brothers and sisters, or lay teachers and employees, and contracts with the federal government, especially those with strings attached. Like I said, you accept this money, and then you have to do these things in our boarding school. We have some of that. We don't have a lot. Wish you had a lot more. Unfortunately, when and people at archive on this presentation will tell you it's a rather hard work, because if a school closed, where does that information go? Sometimes it goes to diocese. Sometimes it goes to the mother house, or where the brothers are. Sometimes the information is just destroyed. So again, it's kind of a research project in itself, just to find out where this information is. Okay. And last, what we're asking bishops to do is cooperation with any investigation, federal government investigation, state investigation, and now tribal investigations. Now, this is very important. The truth does not hurt anybody. We never be afraid of the truth. The avoidance of the truth and saying, well, this will be embarrassing to the Catholic Church, so therefore we're not going to say it, that becomes very destructive to everybody, including the Roman Catholic Church. There's been many investigations by tribal governments, the federal governments, and individuals. What the Wall-Coakley letter asks the bishops is to let all investigations have the full support of the bishops, the archbishops, and the diocese. Not just investigation from the federal government, but especially for tribal investigations. The search for truth is everybody's responsibility. So we just don't wait until the federal government or even tribal governments want to do investigations. We start these investigations ourselves. When we talk about investigations and cooperation, you have to keep in mind the 3 T's. The T's. First, transparency. Second, trust. And last, time. Transparency, trust, and time. Transparency is that we want to make sure we don't hide anything. We make the information public, those that were legally to make public, that we automatically trust those who are doing investigations. We don't say that they have an ulterior motive, but we trust them. And time. Investigations are just not going to happen this year or next 5 years, but this is an ongoing concern that an investigation is that we're going to work with them no matter if it's 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, or in 20 years down the line, that it's not limited by time. With the idea of cooperation, keep in mind that the relationship between tribal governments and the Catholic Church is not a relationship of equals, meaning that all of us need to build up trust is responsibility for the Roman Catholic Church, that we do not ask the tribal entities or elders or even federal government to trust us. It's up to us because we're the ones who committed the sin, the evil. It's up to us to build up that trust. So the concern, the responsibility for building trust is ourselves and not for everybody else to build up that trust. What do we need to build up trust? There's a couple of things. What we say is what we do. We follow through. We tell, we promise a native, our leaders, our elders, or the tribal governments, what we do, then we have to do it. Natives have a long history of broken promises, so it's very important that we keep our promises. With the investigations, we are, of course, native run, not only for direct cooperation, but also listen to the voices and those that we need to heal. The Catholic Native groups are center of what we're doing with this healing. They tell us what to do. We don't tell them what to do. So we have to be very important to make sure that the dialogue, the information, even our listening sessions is always Native run, that we listen to them and they don't have to listen to us. And keep in mind that we're doing this because we're Christ-centered. At all times, the rules of cooperation come from our faith. It's not it comes because we're social justice ministers or anything like that. It comes very much from our faith. And last, healing is a process. It's not a one-time event. If we not see the results of what we started, then we have to learn from that and we have to try again, that we continue working on this process of healing. And we don't say, okay, we've done enough healing, and we move on to other things. This is, again, a long and involved process. I want to talk about the American Indian Catholic Schools Network. This is an organization that is runs out of Notre Dame. It's part of their ACE program, and they do a lot of things. It's an organization of Catholic schools, Native Catholic schools on reservations. It's not all of them because they have a high degree of standards. Only those who can live up to these standards are allowed to be in this part of this organization. I know some people ask me, they get these letters all the time about Native schools, Catholic Native schools, are wanting their donations. And they ask me, is this Catholic school worthy of their donations? I always say, hey, look for the American Indian Catholic Schools Network. Look for their symbol, because they have standards that are the best of the best of Catholic Indian schools in the United States. So that becomes very important in terms of giving your money to or your donations to. Anyway, I've been involved with this organization for the last 7 years, but I'm particularly involved with Macaw on the idea of healing and reconciliation, the subgroup of their pastoral plan of the American Indian Schools Catholic Network. And what they do is they go to reservations to their schools, and they conduct listening sessions with their tribal leaders and the elders of the community. But they also put standards, learning from the past, knowing that all these things were done in the past, but we make sure that we do the opposite. It's kind of like for those who had a really bad parent and they grow up and say, hey, I've learned from that bad parent not to do the same. So these people, the Catholic Indian Schools Network has really taken that to heart and want to do the opposite. So they do a lot of things. Number one, they teach their native language where the school is throughout all the grades. The Red Cloud Indian School does that, even beginning with kindergarten. They have the names, the Lakota names of everything on their doors, so people get to learn from, they're fluent in Lakota, and they teach it in all the grades. They teach Native cultures, and then they have a big process of reporting abuse, so this abuse doesn't happen. So they kind of embrace the Native cultures, they get away from that cultural genocide, and they are watchful of abuse. And of course, they work with, again, their Native organizations and Native communities. It all becomes very important of the Catholic Indian Schools Network, trying to learn from doing things different from what we are doing in the past. Also, for a lot of schools, one of the most important ways that a child get out of poverty, a Native child get out of poverty, is to attend one of these Catholic schools, which becomes very important. So when some natives say that we should abolish all the Catholic schools on reservations because of the past, I said no, because a lot of kids will be in this cold cycle of poverty if they did not have these schools. Okay. Going on, Secretary Holland's report. I hope everybody's read it. There is a section dealing specifically about religious schools. Unfortunately, it's a very small section. Most of it dealt with the government and government schools. Section 8 talks about the role of religious institutions and organizations in the federal Indian boarding school system. It quotes the Merriam report done 1928, and then it says about federal funding stopped in 1897. And it probably was a little further than that, but that's all talked about. There's actually another report coming hopefully soon that'll deal specifically on religious schools, Catholic schools, and hopefully that we would do more research, and they'll talk to the USCCB, especially with the government affairs, to get some good truth out there so everybody can have that benefit of a second report coming out. Okay, let's go on to next steps. As stated earlier, the process is not a one-time event. The sin, pain, and powerlessness happened over 100 years. Patience and being ready to engage in this process of long-term commitment and dedicated work. What we need to do more of this. We need to gather more information, continue to collect all information related to the Catholic boarding schools, and then find a specific place to put all this information, this archival work, which becomes very important. Step 2, a code of conduct for all schools that work with Native Americans, Catholic Native Americans, as the American Indian Schools Catholic Schools Network has done. The network has a code of conduct for all the schools associated with the network, but we need to work more and make sure that these schools do have a code of conduct. Take all abuse seriously. If a child, as we do try to do in our own Catholic Church, if a child or adult even suspects abuse, that has to be taken seriously, not only to the school, but also to the diocese and archdiocese as well. We take all abuse seriously. At all levels of Catholic Native education, teach spirituality, narrative, and the history of local tribes, especially using Native sources. I said, with an elder from the community into your classroom becomes very important. Find ways to educate a larger Catholic population about boarding schools. They've done a lot of work in Canada about that. They have a specific curriculum, and we have to do more of that in our own Catholic Church, of having a curriculum to educate the wider community about these Catholic boarding schools. And then implement all recommendations developed by Native Catholic listening sessions. Some listening sessions do have a part where the natives who've gone through this abuse or survivors, they talk about this is what we want to see, to make sure that that's talked about in our listening sessions and then brought up to me, so I'm bring it up to the subcommittee of Native American Affairs so I can act on what they say, what they want. So again, it's just not a listening session, but a formulation for going forward. Okay. Conclusion. When confronted with harm that we have done as church, we have a structure to use our faith and calls us to admit, embrace, and take action on the harm that we have caused. It does not diminish our faith. It takes positive steps in admitting our sins, our wrongs of the church. In fact, quite the opposite. It strengthens our faith. It's how we handle these evils that we have caused is far more important than what we say about it. Okay, so we have a process in place to do that. Keep in mind, reconciliation, healing is a process, as I said before. And very importantly, is a change of the status quo. Things do not remain the same after we've gone through this process of healing. Is to have an open heart to suffering and then doing something about it. Okay. We have, I think, another 21 minutes. So we can go on to the second. I think we're going to hold questions to the very end. So I have a second part. We'll see how far we got in the second part. Like, second part is going to be a little bit of history. Usually I go with history first, but I got people who asked me to do the part about our Catholic response first. So we're going to do some history here. Okay, for the historical overview, I want to do three things. I'll give an overview of the boarding school period with causes and consequences. I'll talk about common themes that will come up again when we get to action, what has been done or what we talked about before. Not only talk about the people involved, but contextualize history in terms of faith. So those are three things I want to set out to do. Okay, boarding school history. Okay, we can't talk about boarding schools, we just talk about Catholic and also the federal government without talking about treaty obligations. Okay, when a treaty is made with Native communities, there are certain obligations that the federal government takes on in exchange for land. I'm going to take your land, therefore I'm going to give you a treaty that says this is what we're going to do when I take your land. This is how we're going to take care of you because of land taken. Almost always, Native welfare is guaranteed in the treaty. By welfare, a lot of treaties, most treaties, include education. It comes to the federal government's responsibility to educate Natives in these treaties. This responsibility by the federal government can be farmed out to the other agencies, to the states, including religious institutions, but it's still the duty of the federal government to make sure this obligation is fulfilled the best way possible. So we start by talking about boarding schools as a part of treaty obligations. We see the first part of this in 1817, and this is when we first get involved in boarding schools in the Indian Civilization Act. Thomas McHenry was a Quaker, a strong supporter of Indian welfare. He became superintendent of Indian Affairs. At that time, Indian Affairs was under the War Department as a precursor of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. This act set a payment system that lasted into the 20th century. The beginning of the federal government's sponsoring of Native schools thought was to civilize, quote unquote, the Natives, not to educate. And it's going to be a theme that's going to be throughout the centuries. The idea, and I have to get away from the idea that Native schools were there to educate Natives. They were there to civilize. It begins at 1819 and continues even up to the 1970s. Now, this act at the very beginning funded both government and religious schools. We had treaty obligations. Treaties began to say that we have responsibility to educate Natives, and therefore, this is the first time we're going to actually fund these schools, both religious, non-religious, and government schools. And then that continues until 1869. Okay, the peace policy of 1869. President Grant's peace policy of 1869 did a lot of things. Most important was to put almost all schools out of the hands of the federal government. Now, Grant had a problem. He had these Indian agents who would actually bid for their jobs. And then when we get to these reservations that were set up by the federal government, they had to recoup their loss. So they began exploiting the Natives, kind of embezzling a lot of their money and kind of abusing Natives and not getting a lot in return. So when that was brought to the attention of President Grant, he removed most of these Native agencies and feared that religious groups such as the Quakers or the Mennonites or the Presbyterians would have a better, or be more moral, and they would do a lot better in terms of helping the Natives. For many, these agents, the corruption was well known. Grant instead changed the federal agencies to religious organizations to run many aspects of reservations, especially education. So it's not education, but a lot of these reservations were fully under control of these religious organizations. In 1869, there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment. So most of the reservations went to Protestant groups. Some Natives, such as Lakota, asked specifically for the black robes for the Jesuits. So the Natives themselves would ask for a Catholic institution rather than these Protestants. There were some Catholic schools and Catholic agencies, but almost all of them went to Protestants. Okay, forced removal of children. Okay, again, we had a treaty obligation that you have to educate natives in reservations. However, it became clear that from the War Department after President Grant, there was the U.S. Indian Wars. So therefore, the government was trying to find ways to pacify the Indians rather than using arms. Not because arms were immoral, just because having stations of troops were highly expensive. So it's used these native schools to pacify natives. Again, they were not used for education. They're more used for pacification, saying if we made these people more part of the white culture, they'll be less likely to have wars against the federal government. So therefore, because we want to pacify or quote civilize, then soon after President Grant, the education became at one time voluntary. Now it became forced. It became non-voluntary. Long before mandated education being widespread, mandated education of Native children became commonplace in treaties beginning far back as 1819. They were just not enforced. By peace policy, mandated education was rule in treaties rather than exception. The peace policy gave Indian agents the ability to enforce compulsory education, and that includes going to these families and literally kidnapping children, taking these kids away from their mothers and fathers and putting them far away into these boarding schools. The 1891 legislation was passed by Congress extending compulsory school attendance to all Indians, and in 1929, much authority to enforce this attendance was given to the states. I'm talking about the sheriff, we're talking about even the federal agents to enforce mandatory education. Native tribes were universally opposed to mandated education, of course, because the mandated education was designed by whites. It was not, again, it was not, as I said before, and again, common theme, it was not to educate these children. It was to, again, to pacify, to make them more white. The idea, and you have to go back to the time in the early or late 1800s and the early 1900s, and it seems kind of strange to us, but the mindset at the time was the natives were being wiped out. Their culture, their way of life was soon going to be erased, kind of like the dinosaurs. And the best way to help them out is to make them as white as possible in terms of the culture. So they figured they were doing something good by, again, removing native culture and native language in order to make them as part of the white culture as possible. That sounds bizarre to us. It caused a lot of pain, suffering, and caused a lot of abuse. But that was the mentality back then. But the court case of Sioux Tribe versus the United States, the court said that when the government has responsibility in the treaty to provide for education, tribal students must be compelled to attend. That the Supreme Court said that, I think it was 1929. In the beginning, Native boarding schools had one purpose only, and that's, again, to wipe out Native cultures. That's the only purpose. Okay. Let's talk about the model for Indian schools. And that's Carlisi Indian School. Okay, the school was founded in 1879 and continued for 35 years until 1918. Why is this important? Because this is the model of not only government boarding schools, but later on, Catholic boarding schools. The school's founder was Army General Pratt. He was made charge of making sure that Cheyenne would stay on the reservation in Oklahoma. He was kind of a police officer. When Cheyenne would go off the reservation, he would round them up and bring them back to the reservation. Sometimes you just sent those troublemakers to prison. There's a native prison in Augustine, Florida. This is where Geronimo was sent. And the General Pratt, because he was so successful getting these natives or finding these natives and getting back on the reservation, that he was sent over there to run this prison. He soon organized the prison as a military base with work, drills, military structure, and discipline. Now, you have to think about these boarding schools became a model, not from a education or school model, it came directly from this prison. General Pratt ran this prison and he said, hey, this is a great idea to run a school. So he took a prison model, and grafted it onto running a school. He accomplished this, and then Dawes and other people say, hey, this is a very good model. We give you a school to run. So again, that's what he did. In the school, students were required to have their hair cut, as in military fashion, their names changed, not speak their native language. Physical punishment, such as corporal punishment, and isolation were common, again, directly this prison model. The majority of the graves were Apache. He took the kids directly from the prison in Augustine, which was mostly Apache, and sent the kids over to the sporting school. That's why when the kids died, a lot of them were buried at the sporting school. This is now in Pennsylvania. A lot of them were Apache. The cause of death were disease, malnutrition, and suicide. For the children that survived this boarding school, they had to suffer through isolation, brutality, harsh living conditions, family separation, cultural separation, and removal of their native language. All goes out to the idea of generational trauma. The school as a model. Unfortunately, because of widespread support, this military model, this prison model, sure became a model inspiration not only for government boarding schools, but for all schools, including religious schools, including Catholic schools. The design was to remove all aspects of Indian culture. Pratt's often quoted line, kill the Indian to save the man, optimizes this idea, this ideology, and is based on a racist ideology. There are 5 distinct aspects of this model, this boarding school. Removal from the family. We say as a Catholic Church, the family is the first educators, as I said before, such as compassion, family dynamics, and a sense of love. All that is removed. Removal of the culture. The white culture is not seen as alien, but seen as first and foremost. Their native culture is seen as alien. That's how we teach these kids in these schools. Seeing all aspects of culture, including language, as bad, as evil. Forcing religion. It might seem kind of strange that we did that in the Catholic Church, because it does violate not only our law, our canon law, but it violates our faith sense that we talk about religion as being something that's a free choice. But a lot of these schools, both Catholic and Protestant, force their religion. Harsh living conditions. A lot of these schools just didn't have the money to run these schools, even when they were getting money from the federal government. So they had very harsh living conditions. And as I said before, because the model was the idea of prisons treating kids as prisoners. Federally funded religious schools. From 1879 to 1928, the U.S. government funded religious boarding schools, including Catholic schools. With that funding came regulations that included the prohibition to allow children to speak their language. Even after federal funding was stopped, unfortunately, Catholic boarding schools continued this government approach. So there's records when the government was stopped funding with all these strings attached and says, we're not going to fund you anymore. They continued on their policies that they inherited from where the federal government funded these schools, where these strings attached. Lack of federal funds shifted the response of Catholic schools to raising their own money. That means that they had to cater to the rest of society, improving that they have turned away that children have turned away native ways and are transformed to the white society. Going out, that's the only way that you can get money, is say, hey, we've totally transformed these natives. They're no longer part of that native community, but they're now part of that white community. And when we did that, then we could get the funds from the wider white society. Again, incredibly destructive. Also ways short funds deprive natives even of their basic needs. Before an action pictures become the norm in terms of fundraising. So we see in the web, we see this native child dressed in his native regalia, and then he or her is different and has a uniform and cut hair. Those are from fundraisers. That's how they try to raise money. Even today, Native Catholic schools find it difficult to walk a fine line or reclaim a need without degrading Native life. And we talk a lot about that with the Catholic Indian Schools Network about how do we go about doing that, because we need funds in order to fund these schools, but we also want to honor Native life. Okay. You said that. Go on to this one. Roots and racism. Missionary discernment is the ability to decide what's part of one's culture and what's part of Christ. As a missionary, that's especially working with natives, that's the first thing you ask yourself for is what I'm doing, what I'm saying, what I'm thinking. Is that part of my culture or is that part of Christ? Because if you don't do that, then you embrace a form of racism, which becomes very, very destructive. The business pastoral document, Open Wide Our Hearts, the enduring call of love, a pastoral letter against racism, it states, in many boarding schools and orphanages, the objective was to Americanize Native children by forcing them to abandon all facets of their cultural life, including their native language. The tragedy of boarding school period begins with a certain ideology, the idea that cultures are stratified, with certain European cultures having a superiority from the rest. The sin of racism, and the sin today as it was a sin 200 years ago, has led to a greatest American evil, including slavery, segregation, Japanese internment, and also Native boarding schools. Racist ideology is sinful because forced divisions or divisions do not exist in the eyes of Christ. What may have been seen, felt, interpreted by helping others is in reality is a very brutal force destroying others if we have the roots in racism. If we don't do that discernment, if we don't say, I'm going to work with Native or any other group and discern this is part of Christ and this is not part of Christ, this is a part of the culture that I grew up with. And it's very important to do that discernment. Okay. Yep, do that. Let's talk about self-image. There's been a lot of studies conducted concerning Native self-image, especially the self-image of young Native and indigenous. When a child is put down so many times, he or she begins to internalize an image based on what he or she has heard. If their culture is continually devalued, humiliated, abused, there are long-term spiritual and psychological consequences. To reinforce a healthy self-image, aspect of a child's culture needs to be conveyed and embraced and have a high intrinsic value. These are studies that a child who has based and knows his or her culture, and that child does a lot better in school, and a lot better in life. I'm going to go through some of this because I notice we're running out of time. What happens to future generations? Not all Natives were victims of boarding schools. However, because trauma faced by the survivors affect all Native members, all of society becomes victimized. And from boarding schools that go on to the second, third, and fourth generations, skills not taught at boarding schools include respect for Native cultures, respect for Native languages, non-ruthless ways to upbring children, suspicion and disrespect for the family of origin. All those have generational problems and generational difficulties. Many survivors talk about the difficulties in returning to their families, where they did not speak the language and were taught to be scornful of their culture. Okay, we're going to, in 1 minute, so we're going to just skip the drip. Hopefully everybody's read the drip. The drip is the United Nations Declaration of Rights of the Indigenous Peoples. And Pope Francis has quoted this. So if you haven't read it, please read it. It's very important. And the U.S., of course, is not a signatory to it, but it still becomes very important. We'll skip that one. Conclusions, what to keep in mind. Understanding history will help us with the steps on how to promote reconciliation and healing. The adage, knowing where you have been so you know where you're going, applies here. We talked about in our first section, we talked about what we want to do in the Catholic Church in terms of healing and reconciliation, but that cannot be done until we know our history and where their abuse, both cultural, physical, and spiritual abuse happened, where that came from, and then we can apply the concerns that we have from our Roman Catholic Church. And the idea is to go beyond the apology and to have common strategies and develop a plan that is determined by events and media. And that is it. Okay, questions? I'm going to stop sharing now.
We invite you to take some time. Maybe you might need just time to just a quiet moment to just hold those things that that you have heard. And we invite you to use the chat feature. And we have two people from our planning committee that will be watching the chat feature to add your questions, your comments, your concerns. Is there anything that you wanted to hear that you didn't hear? Is there anything that you heard that you wanted to amplify? What questions do you have? So let's take a moment or two for people to use the chat feature. And then Alyssa and Margaret Mary, when you're ready, if you'd like to go through what's in the chat and present those questions to Father Mike.
Okay, well, one thing, Father Mike, that people were asking is, it seemed a little vague. It said, who should take these steps that you're talking about? And I know you mentioned at the end that people could contact you in your office, but what steps first, and then how to get in touch with you? And then secondly, where's the accountability of the bishops, the Wall-Coakley letter? If bishops don't have to opt in, they can do what they want. So they can just remain, the document can just remain a document, and a lot of people won't know about it or act on it. So that's three things.
We'll take the last one first. Yes, this is the Subcommittee Native American Affairs of the USCCB. We set a policy concern for the bishops. All bishops in the United States, from our canon law, from our church, they're all independent, so they can do whatever they want in terms of their diocese or archdiocese. There are a couple of exceptions. The only person ahead of all bishops is, of course, Pope Francis in the Vatican. He's the only one who can tell bishops what to do. Bishops cannot tell each other what to do. So they're very much independent. But we do have, and it can't be diminished, we do have moral authority, saying that in order, if you're interested in this issue, this concern, then we do have that structure in place. And more importantly, if you, for a parish or a lay person involved, wants to get involved in this issue, such as developing listening sessions or asking the archdiocese where they are in terms of their archives, or where is the archives where we get information out, they can use this letter. They can say, the bishops, this comes from the USCCB, this comes from Subcommittee on Native American Affairs. It says this is our structure in place for our Roman Catholic Church. How do you answer this? And the bishops can say, well, no, I'm not going to answer it at all. But my work with bishops, I've been working with bishops for some 7 years, that a lot of bishops want to get involved. They want to know what can be done. The first steps is they don't know what to get involved. They don't know the concerns. They don't know if there's a boarding school in their diocese or archdiocese. So you can say, hey, we want you to get involved. This is what we want you to do. And this is how we want you to do it. And then the letter gives them a structure on how to do that. It becomes very important. What was the other question, Margaret?
The other question was, how do they be in touch with you? And also the plan seems vague. How do they get started on doing one of these listening sessions or something like that?
Both in the same. They can contact with me, and I can contact those who have been involved in these listening sessions. Most successful is of course Oklahoma, but there's also been Washington State and now involved in Detroit and others. So get in contact with me. One of the problems that we're trying to back away from a structure of these listening sessions, because I said before in my my presentation, it depends on the natives. Native culture is very different. It's like when you say natives, it's like saying Europeans. That Irish are very, very much different than people from Italy. So we have to understand the culture that you're trying to do these listening sessions first. There's some general themes and general ideas, that I get you involved with, Macaw has also worked on the same Macaw. Black Elk has also worked on the same issues and same concerns, and they can also help you too. But in terms of an exact structure in place, we're trying to get away from that and saying that we're trying to adapt to the local community. And you get in touch with me by a simple, first of all, I have a website. So you go USCCB, you scroll down to offices and committees, and then I'm under the Cultural Diversity Church. It says Native American Subcommittee. Click on that. And then it shows a lot of great information, not only on boarding schools, but all the other things that we're doing at the USCCB. And my email address is mcarson, like my name, mcarson@usccb.org. That's it. USCCB.org.
USCCP.
USCCB.org.
USCCP.
No, B, bishops. It's,
Bishop, United States Council of Bishops.org.
B.
USCCB.
But
Okay.
I love getting these involved in these listening sessions. As I said before in my presentation, that out of all the things that we do as a Roman Catholic Church, that is direct conversation with those who are involved in the historical trauma, those involved in being abused in the boarding schools. So it's the best part of healing, reconciliation. And people who are involved in this have really saw the joy and celebration come to their heart when they get involved in those issues. So I really like it, getting people involved.
Mhm.
And so does the bishops too. We've had a lot of great support from the bishops when we have these listening sessions. The bishop has come to these listening session groups and say, what can I do to help these listening sessions? So the bishops have also been very involved.
Mhm. A question related to that, Father Mike, is how will this effort be communicated throughout the U.S. Church? And is there a plan for a global communication?
Yeah, well, by having webinars like we're doing, the letter has been sent out to all bishops in the United States, bishops and archbishops in the United States, and just for yourselves, for people in the pews, Roman Catholics, just to keep the idea going forward, just to bring it to your bishops, to your archbishops, to your diocesan staff, saying this is important, and just to keep that in mind. In terms of globally, we're actually doing a lot more globally than we have, especially when the bishops in fact has visited Canada. So we're trying to work a lot of these issues and concerns about these boarding schools. They've been faced by 4 countries specifically: Canada, Australia, United States, and New Zealand. Those are the 4 countries that we have a little group. I have counterparts in all other 3 countries. They're trying to work together to find out what we've done wrong, what we've done right, how do we move this issue forward. So we're trying to do this globally also, especially with those 4 countries.
Mhm. Let's see. I think another question that people could ask is, can settler people or white Europeans take initiative? And how can they get something going? Does it have to come from tribal nations? And if you don't have someone close to you, how would you get involved?
Yeah, they could do all things in terms of finding archive work, helping in terms of improving their relationship with tribes, and helping out in investigations. They can do all things. The only thing that kids concerned about is listening sessions, because we want to make sure that we do not tell natives that they have to heal, they have to forgive from a settler community. It just does not work, and is quite the opposite of what we're trying to accomplish. However, you can work with listening sessions and find somebody in your community who are a tribal member who's interested in this issue, and help them out in terms of developing these listening sessions, saying that we want to do these listening sessions, we want to hear from you, what do you think will be involved, and then how you can help them in terms of healing and reconciliation. That's the only one I would say that you can help out, but in terms of leading, I would really prefer a native of that particular tribe to do these listening sessions.
Mhm.
Somebody asked, how will this effort be communicated throughout the U.S. Church? What is your global communications plan?
Trying to do exactly what I'm doing, doing webinars. The conference has done a great job in terms of this. The American Catholic Schools, Indian Schools Network has done a great job, especially in the local community. And it's up to also all of you who are on this this webinar is to grab hold of this and say, this is what we want to do as a Roman Catholic Church, and start from your parish or from your diocese and get your bishops involved, saying, I'm really excited about this issue. I want to run with it. And this is a structure in place from the USCCB. How can you help me in terms of doing these things that the bishops have called, or the letter has called us to do?
Mhm. There's a question here about this code of conduct. Can you say some of the elements that are involved in it? And another question is, when you get together with tribal people, is English spoken, or are interpreters used?
For this code of conduct from the American Catholic Indian Schools Network, it's still being formulated. It's one of the committees that I'm not on in terms of strategic plan, is having a code of conduct. Right now, it is understood that you will be teaching native languages, the native language at all grades. You'll have cultural elements in terms of the classroom and how you celebrate Mass and other things, and a very specific program to report abuse, far more specific than the diocese or the superintendent has. All those are now understood. They just haven't been written down yet, and there might be others. So there's another committee from the American Indian Schools Catholic Network are working on these. I'm not part of that committee because I have a lot of other things to do. But I would contact Brian Collier, Dr. Brian Collier from the American Catholic Indian Schools Network to get more specifics. And they have a great webpage. So just go on their webpage and get more information from that. It's part of Notre Dame, it's part of the ACE program.
The question about language, when we get together with people.
Oh, yes. So we get together people, it depends on the tribe. And when I was working in the Navajo Nation, all things were done with the, I think it's changed now, but all official things were done in the Navajo language. So we had to have an interpreter. There are things such as in the Archdiocese of Oklahoma and the Diocese of Tulsa, they don't need interpreters because they speak the English language. So it depends on the tribe and the listening session. It's part of the cultural idea that I talked about earlier.
What stance has your group taken on urging Rome to revoke the Doctrine of Discovery papal bull?
Yeah, that's not above, that's far above my pay grade. I'm just a lowly assistant director here. So we're talking about people that talk directly to Rome. We have people who do that. That's in the 5th floor, right up there. It's certainly not on the 4th floor. So again, we have people who directly talk to Rome. And I get some indications. They occasionally want my advice. And so I give them advice when they talk to Rome. But in terms of beyond that, no, it's far beyond my pay grade.
There's a question here of how many religious orders sponsored schools and are all involved in these efforts to make accountability and healing.
Yeah, I wish they were. I presume that most of them are. Those who are been notified they had a boarding school, either current or closed. In terms of that, the AHP is actually working as we speak on a comprehensive list of Catholic boarding schools from the last 200 years. So hopefully that list will come out soon. In fact, we just had a meeting earlier, just talk about that list and the best way to get it forward. But yes, if most of the religious orders that I've been involved with, in fact, all the religious orders I've been involved with, those that contact me are very much involved in this issue and want to promote healing and reconciliation.
Somebody said, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead, Alyssa.
Somebody said, please talk of the conduct code. What did it cover?
As I said before, the contact code that I'm aware of comes from the American Indian Schools Network, because they have a special group. We're talking about a couple of years ago, they worked on strategic planning, and they divided up into many committees. One of the committees was to codify the things that they've already talked about. One, teaching language, native language, teaching cultural elements in the grades, having the abuse policy. All those things are very important, but they're still talking about how to put that in place and how to rework it. I'm not part of that committee, so I don't know what they've done so far. I do know in order to be part of the network, it's 5 schools on the network, you do have to meet several standards, and those standards are the ones I just talked about.
Mm-hmm. Well, Father Mike, Sister Betsy is asking if you will provide a list of bishops who are supportive. And she added not supportive. I don't suppose we're going to publicize those, but
yeah, because I really, really enjoy my work, and I don't want to be fired and put on the parking lot with my all my possessions. The best thing is to ask your bishop or your archbishop where you are in the stance, and then once you find out, come inform me. But I don't think I'm going to go there.
I think if there's one more question, I think we can take time for one more.
Yeah, somebody said in my town outside of Chicago, most public meetings begin with acknowledgement of native lands on which the meeting is held. Is this becoming more common?
Yes, it is actually. I've done it myself. Before I go to a place, I try to find out where the tribe was there before. I do that here in DC, but I've seen it actually in my 7 years here. I see more people doing that. We do that at the Tequila conference, and I think it's kind of very important to realize that, especially in terms of treaty obligations, this land was taken from somebody, and from what the agreements were made when this land was taken, if any. So that becomes very, very important.
do you think you'd like to tell people when the Tequila conference is, and it's not just limited to Native Americans, that anyone can join in?
Sure, I would certainly go for the plug. Going through my calendar here, the Tequila conference is starting on Wednesday the 19th, I believe, July 19th.
Yes.
It's at Minnesota. It's on their webpage, I guess, techconf.org, isn't it?
TEKAK conf CONF.
.org.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought so. Yes, I gave a presentation last year on this boarding school. A lot of it I gave to you. Next presentation I'll give, hopefully, if they accept me, is that on the missing and exploited women and human trafficking in a cultural Native context.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Father Mike and audience, I want to thank all of you. We have some ways of completing our time together. First of all, Father Mike, I want to thank you for the breadth and the depth of your presentation. And I think most important, I'd like to say, I want to thank you for the direct honesty that you have brought to the issue, to the concern, by calling it what it is, by calling racism, and naming and calling sin, sin. I think the honesty about these and being forthright in naming what has happened and why it should not have happened is a very important step towards healing for the whole church, for Native people in particular, but all of us, settler and Native, and all others that are part of this land. This is very important, and I think your contribution, I think, is very important. And as a member of AHP, I just want to thank you for all of the support that you have given us in our 2 years of development, and we're still growing. And we're just very grateful for our relationship with you, and through you, with the relationship that we do have with USCCB, because we do need to move forward together. We realize that there were lots of questions that are in the chat. We intend to have our time formally close at the in Eastern time. It would be at 2:30, but at whatever the half hour is in your time zone. And then we would like to keep the the phone call or the Zoom call open for informal conversation for about 15 minutes past closing. So if anyone wants to stay on for further, more informal conversation for about 15 minutes or so, you will be very welcome to do this. So we have that. There are some people that are from our subcommittee. The planning committee is the subcommittee of listening, learning, and education. And what I'd like to do is call on each of the people, just name them. If you would say 1 or 2 words about yourself, that way, if people are on gallery view, they'll see you and they'll see who it is that is talking and who it is that I am talking about. So I'd like to begin with Sue and Ray Martell. If you could say something, please.
Hello, all. Thank you for attending today. My husband, Ray Martell, and I are editors and authors of books on Native American enculturation as Christians. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. How about Sue Gardner, if you could speak, please. And maybe she is not here any longer.
Thank you. I'm a Dominican sister from Adrian, Michigan. I'm the director of the Native American Apostolate for the Diocese of Gaylord, and I'm the director of Parish Life for St. Kateri Parish, which is in Peshabi Michigan, on the land of Odawa and Chippewa.
Thank you. Can we now turn to Marty Roars, who's been our tech person for our webinar today, too.
Thank you, Sue, and thanks everyone for attending today, and hope that your tech needs have worked out to the best of our ability. And please remember to sign up for session 2, because there will be a separate link for that session.
Thank you. And then we have Margaret Mary Moore and Alyssa Davis. Margaret Mary, if you would like to just say something, and then Alyssa.
Yeah, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. I'm a social worker and a theologian, and I want to promote diversity in our church and healing.
Thank you. And Alyssa, finally, thank you.
I'm from Portland, Oregon. I have been working in this group for a couple months, and I mainly work with a couple different organizations that also promote healing and bridging the gap.
Thank you. I'd like to take this time just to quickly mention that AHP, and that is now U.S. Catholic Indigenous Boarding School Healing and Accountability Project. We have a former name, but we felt that it was important to just refine our name a bit. We have 3 subcommittees, and some of that has come up in our conversation. Our archives subcommittee has been very active, and they are developing a list of the Catholic involvement in the boarding schools. And we are in conversation about when that can be published and the contribution that it will make when it is published. And we're anticipating that this will be available online sometime in the spring. So you'll be hearing more about that. We have religious accompaniment, and that is a subcommittee that is devoting its energies specifically to the needs that particular religious communities have as they are coming to terms with their history, their historical institutional involvement. And then you're getting to know us as listening, learning, and education, because we're the ones that are presenting this webinar to you. So again, I want to thank Father Mike for your presentation and your support and work with AHP, all the members that we have just named of the current members of the Listening, Learning, Education Subcommittee. Also want to extend our thanks to the Sisters of St. Joseph of Carondelet in St. Paul, Minnesota, because they have hosted this webinar, and also to the Congregation of St. Joseph, my own community, for financial support that it has been provided for this webinar. And we thank you for joining us today. I would like to just mention before we take closing prayer that we will meet at the same time in 2 weeks, and we have Dr. Amy Bombay. Dr. Amy Bombay is Anishinaabe from Rainy River First Nations. She is Canadian, therefore, and she is assistant professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And she is from the Department of both nursing and psychiatry. And she has done amazing work on studying the intergenerational effects of trauma as related to boarding schools. In Canada, they're referred to as residential schools. The systems are so strongly parallel between our two countries. And so the research that Amy has done is very pertinent to our situation in the US as well as the Canadian situation. And her research has to do with the intergenerational trauma, how it is passed down from one generation to the next, but also how resiliency within the cultures, within the tribes themselves is passed down and what that can do to contribute to healing. So we encourage you and welcome you to sign up. I think we might be putting the registration link in the chat. You should have received the information on the brochure. And just to reinforce what Marty just said is that there were two links to register for both sessions. So if you haven't registered and want to participate in 2 weeks, you do need to register at that specific link. This link for today will not work for 2 weeks from today. So if you have any questions, please ask those questions about making sure that you are registered. And now it is my privilege and opportunity to introduce and welcome my friend, whom I have never met in person because everything is on Zoom these days, but Jermaine Little Bear Lakota from Rapid City, South Dakota, who will lead us in a closing prayer.
Hello, everyone. I am also an associate of the Sisters of St. Francis of Penance Christian Charity, and they've been on one of our Zooms at different times. But during this Lent, we're really praying to St. Francis, the peace prayer. And so I thought that I would close it because that to me reminds me of exactly what we're trying to do in our AHP in healing of not only the religious organization, the Catholic Church, but also the Indigenous people. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to read the prayer of St. Francis in our closing prayer. Okay, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, let me sow pardon. Where there is discord, let me sow unity. Where there is error, let me sow hope. Where there is darkness, let me sow light. Where there is sadness, let me sow joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive, it is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Thank you.
Jermaine, thank you very much for bringing us to this type of ending with your closing prayer, and for the heart that is yours that is in this prayer. So thank you very much. Thank you, all participants. And we are officially closed, but we'll stay on for another 15 minutes for anyone who would like to have informal conversation. Thank you. And for those of you who are leaving, goodbye. We hope to see you in 2 weeks. And then we'll welcome the conversation with people who want